Good morning.
Good morning.
Don't hear you. Try that again.
Good morning.
Much better. Sorry, I guess my angle doesn't really show you much of me, but
Yeah, we're a little bit in the dark, but it's fine as long as we can hear you.
yes. I don't think you'll see my silhouette. So
yes.
So let's give Hanan a minute because it's a tricky daf, and the beginning really matters a lot.
Okay.
Starting. But again, I think, as we said yesterday, I'll send out an email. I think we should do an hour before Mincha on both days.
Okay.
And Simchat Torah. Should be fun.
Yeah. A little bit tricky, but okay.
Why, it's too late? Too early?
I don't know.
Just long days?
Yeah, more that, I guess.
I mean, what James said is, there's like a half hour to Mincha Maariv. I'm not sure why, though, to be honest, but.
Yeah, there's no speech or anything, right?
Yeah, Stephen usually does his trivia then.
Okay.
I'm not sure if he's doing it then. It says Mincha 6, Hakafot 6:50. I mean, because there's usually a lot of kids programming. There's a lot of stuff that usually goes on that I don't think is actually happening. So, I don't know. Thank you for the pictures, Miriam.
I get them from who is it that we get them from? MDY.
So what you're showing here is one on the shoulders and one in their hands.
Right. Exactly. This is interesting because before I saw the pictures, I really could not visualize the hands. I didn't think about the way that it was going to, and it's silly because it makes perfect sense, but I just was imagining something completely different. So this works.
Yeah. So it's good to have the pictures.
Yeah, once in a while.
We'll get started without Hanan, unfortunately. Hopefully he'll join. So today's daf is daf Chaf Vav 26, and we were up to the Mishnah, which is the last word on Chaf Hey Amud Bet. And the Mishnah goes through a very important case, which again is very complicated. So I hope we can stick through with keep it clear. But the basic principles that there's a halacha in the Torah of a bechor, that a firstborn animal has to be given to a kohen. A kohen cannot eat that animal. A kohen has to take that animal to the Beit HaMikdash, bring it as a karban, and then they can eat it, of course. Now that's a very inconvenient thing for a couple of reasons. One is that the Beit HaMikdash might be very far away. And the second, of course, bigger reason is that there may not be a Beit HaMikdash. And so nowadays, it's a very tricky thing. As we learned in Masechet, or maybe we will learn in Masechet Bechorot,
I did that one. That was my first one. I don't know how much I got out of it, but.
So Masechet Bechorot, we discussed the basic idea, which is, of course, that if an animal can't be brought as a karban on the mizbeach because it has a mum, then you don't have to bring it as a karban. And so it would be very advantageous for a kohen who has a bechor to have that bechor get a mum, so that he can then shecht it in his backyard and eat it for lunch, right? So, and that's of course what they do. You have to keep your bechor around until it gets a mum, and then once it gets a mum, you can eat it, okay? The problem, of course, is that whenever it's very advantageous for a person to have an outcome, they're more likely to game the system to get that outcome, right? This is an obvious rule. And so there was a lot of concern, we're just getting started, there was a lot of concerns we learned in the Gemara in Bechorot that a Kohen would potentially make a mum in an animal or not, maybe not necessarily do it on purpose, but not be careful or not be exact in describing what's a mum. And so they made a rule essentially that no one is allowed to independently verify that their Bechor has a mum. You need to get an expert, a mumche, to give a check, and for obvious reasons. Self-verification is a very fraught thing when the incentive is so high for it to have a mum. And so the basic halacha is that if a kohen has a bechor nowadays, if it's a tam, meaning it has no mum, then he can't slaughter it. And if he does slaughter it, he's actually over in big problems, Rashi says, because it's like you're doing kachim outside the Beit HaMikdash. Because basically it's a karban, it's a dedicated karban. If you shecht it in your backyard, it's like bringing a karban in your backyard, which is pretty bad. It also doesn't work. But once it gets a mum, you keep it around until it gets a mum. And once it gets a mum, you're allowed to eat it. But you have to first get verification from a chacham, from a person who is verified in checking mumim, right, which we learned in Sanhedrin, or I guess that was also a long time ago, is a separate smicha, right? You'd have to get separate permission to be yatir bechorot, if you recall, to permit an animal that's a bechor to be slaughtered. And that's what you have to do to get it, to eat it. Of course, the challenge then comes, is in our Masechet, with Yom Tov, right? Because let's say you're a Kohen, you have a bechor animal, and Yom Tov is starting, right? So you want to know, can I use this bechor for my Yom Tov meal? So first of all, it has to have a mum, right? Rashi understands our Mishnah that the animal has a mum. The problem is that you haven't shown it to a chacham, right? You haven't shown it to a expert yet. So the question is, are you going to do that over Yom Tov? You thought, I don't know, I'll wait till after Yom Tov. I'll bring it to market next time I go to market. Unfortunately, events conspired against you, because what happened was, says the Mishnah, Bechor shenafal lebor. While you have this bechor, again, assuming the case I gave you, which is the simplest case, is that it already has a mum, right? So meaning something is wrong with it. You haven't shown it to a chacham to get verification yet. But on Yom Tov, it falls into a pit. Now, animals don't like falling into pits, right? First of all, they suffer. They probably broke its leg or is hurt or is cold. And second of all, you want to take it out and you want to shecht it, right? But you can't shecht the animal unless someone says it has a mum. So says Rabbi Yehuda, Yered mumcha v'yireh. What you should do is you should go next door to the rabbi, give him some money, hopefully, or whatever, and say, can you come over to my house, climb down into the pit with this very sad cow, and see if you think this is a mum or not. Okay? Continues the Mishnah on top of Chaf Vav Amud Aleph. Im yesh bo mum, if the kohen, not the kohen, if the rabbi or the authority says this is a mum, then ya'alev yishchot. Then you can drag the animal out of the pit, which would normally seem to be prohibited because it's malacha, it's tircha. But if you're going to eat it, you can drag it out and you can shecht it. But im lav lo yishchot. If not, you can't shecht it. Now, obviously, conspicuously absent is, can you take it out of the pit, right? It just says you can't shecht it. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'ein mumo nikar mib'od yom ein zeh min hamuchan. Anything that you did not know that it had a mum, meaning it wasn't checked, from Erev Yom Tov, is not considered to be prepared. Rashi points out the sort of funny part of this, which is that, remember, Rabbi Shimon usually does not hold a muksa. Rabbi Yehuda does hold a muksa. So their opinions are completely switched here. Rabbi Yehuda is saying you're allowed to do this, or Rabbi Shimon is saying you're not allowed to do it. So Rashi explains that Eimin HaMuchan does not mean it's muksa, because Rabbi Shimon does not hold of muksa. It means you're not allowed to have mumim be viewed officially on Yom Tov. And therefore, there's no way to permit this animal. It's not that it's not muchan, it's that it's still a bechor. And Rashi says probably it's because there's a question of din. You're not allowed to do judgment on Yom Tov, and having a Beit Din basically come and assess the animal is equivalent to din. Obviously, there's a long toast to it, so it's much more complicated. But that's the mission. Continues the Gemara. Now, what's the basis for the argument between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda about whether this animal that is a bechor, that has fallen into a bar, can be viewed by a kohen, viewed by a mumcha, by an expert on Yom Tov or not? So, inema, you're probably going to say, based on what I just told you, that bero'in mumin kamiflagi. The question is, can a expert look at a mum on Yom Tov and certify and say, this is a mum, this is not a mum? I mean, can you give certification on Yom Tov itself? Again, presumably the reason it would be prohibited would be because it's like doing judgment. It's like din. something very effortless, not effort, but official. So maybe that's the argument. The Rabbi Yehuda Savar Rowan Mumin B'Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says there's no problem. An expert can see a mum and therefore go down into the pit and see if the animal has a mum.
Is the assumption here that the moon was caused by the fall into the bore, or that he had a moon beforehand?
It's a good question. So I said it when I started the Mishnah, which I think you weren't on for yet, that the assumption is that it had a moon before Yom Tov.
Right.
And it's not, it's a little tricky because it could be that the moon was exacerbated when it fell into the pit. But it already had a moon before Yom Tov, meaning you already thought before Yom Tov, according to Rabbi Yehuda at least, look, my animal is a moon. If I see an expert in shul, I'll ask them to come home with me on the way after shul and look at the animals, meaning you were already...
Right. But you could have done that before Yom Tov. You could have gotten the expert to certify the moon before Yom Tov.
That's a good question.
Then,
You couldn't. It could be you didn't have an expert. But let's continue. The Gemara is going to discuss some of the details about the moon, but not that detailed, to be honest. So maybe the argument is whether you can ro'in mumin, which again doesn't mean see, it means certify mumin on Yom Tov. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can be ro'in mumin, so you do this on Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon Samar, in ro'in mumin be Yom Tov. So that seems very reasonable. But if that was the case, why do we need to have a cow that fell into a pit, right? What does that do with anything? Why don't you just say, if a person has a mum, a bechor, and has a mum, can you call over the chacham from shul or not call over the chacham?
Right.
Obviously, the fact that we introduced this variable of it falling into a pit means that there's something more going on than just the question of ro'in mumin b'yom tov. Says the Gemara, well then why don't you just argue about that? Lif lo b'ro'in mumin de alma. Right? Argue about whether you can have a moon be seen by an expert on Yom Tov. No. We need to tell you, even in a case where it fell into a pit. Because I might have thought that there's another element here, which is that the animal is suffering. Right? The animal fell into a pit, it's hurt. Either, again, whether it's hurt because it physically is hurt or it's scared, but it's suffering. And so the animal is suffering, you might have thought that you can do more. You can la'arim, which literally means to play games, right? To trick. Velaske and take it out. And recall, we had a case, we're going to have a case later, of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua's case later, which we don't quote here, but we will get to, God willing, in around 10 days. Rabbi Yeshua's case is, let's say unfortunately, you have a pit in your house, and an animal and its child fall into the pit on Yom Tov. Oto ve'et beno, right? So an animal and its child, in which case you're stuck, because you can maybe drag the animal out of the pit because you want to shecht it and eat it, or the child, but you can't drag both animals out of the pit because you can't shecht both of them on Yom Tov, right? So there, it's not a question of mum, it's a question of tircha, it's effort. So Rabbi Yeshua has a great solution. He says, Rabbi Yeshua says, what you should do is you should say, that mother or father animal, that mother animal looks very tasty. Let me drag it out of the pit. You take it out of the pit and you say, you know what? That baby looks very tasty. Let me drag that one out of the pit. Right? So basically you play a game in order to prevent suffering for the animal. So you might think that you could do something similar here, that you could say, now again, you can't, there's no real game here, but you might have thought that because we worry about the animal suffering in the pit, that you'd be allowed to take it out of the pit and then ask questions later, right?
And slaughter it.
Sorry?
And slaughter it.
So not necessarily, because you can only slaughter it if you show it to a chacham and they say that it has a mum.
I see.
But maybe you could take it out of the pit because it's suffering and then show it. But at least have it out of the pit, right? So you might have thought la'arim Rabbi Yeshua kamashvan that you can't do that. That the only way you can take it out of the pit is if there was some conceivable way for you to eat it, right? And that would mean you have to show it to a person to say whether it has a mum or not. So the person has to go into the pit to verify it before you can take it out. Says the Gemara, well, if that's true, if that's the halacha according to Rabbi Yeshua, then why does it say in the Mishnah, if it doesn't have a mum, lo yishchot, don't shecht it? It should have said, lo ya'alev yishchot mi ba'ilei. You shouldn't take it out of the pit and shecht it. Remember, I pointed out in the Mishnah that in the beginning it said, if it has a mum, you can take it out and shecht it. If it doesn't have a mum, you can't shecht it. But you're missing out the point. The whole point of our Mishnah is to tell you that if it doesn't have a mum, don't feel like you can take it out of the pit because you feel bad for the animal and you'll shecht it if it has a mum. The Mishnah doesn't say that. It just says don't shecht it. It says, we're telling you, lo tzricha the avar va'aske. The Mishnah is telling you, even if you went against the halacha and you took it out, you're not supposed to take the animal out of the pit. But let's say you did, or let's say someone didn't ask the question, or they felt terrible, right? Someone walked by and they saw this cow suffering in a pit, and they said, we got to help this cow out of the pit. All right, so you're not supposed to do that, but you did it. So now the cow's out of the pit. So the question is, what do you do now? Can you shecht it or not shecht it? And what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is you can't shecht it if it does not have a mum, right? If the chacham did not find a mum. It says where lo tzricha the avar aske. That you can shecht it because it's out of the pit. Kamash Malan that you can't. What are you talking about? Well, why would I have thought Rabbi Yeshua's case is you had a bechor, you took it out of the pit against halacha, it doesn't have a mum, you can't shecht it. So you might have thought you can shecht it. Why in the world would you be able to shecht it? It doesn't have a mum. Remember, a bechor without a mum is kachim. It's a karban. You can't take a karban in your backyard. What lishchate hatamu? That's outrageous. You would never be able to shecht a bechor that doesn't have a mum on Yom Tif. It says where lo tzricha the nafal be'muma. No, the question is it got a mum afterwards, meaning you took it out of the bar. It didn't have a mum, and then later it got a mum, right? So what Rabbi Yoshua is telling you is that's not good enough. Because remember, so again, this goes Hanan to your point. It got the mum when it fell into the pit, right? So what Yeshua is telling you is that's not good enough because I hold of muksa, right? Rabbi Yeshua said. Rabbi Yehuda, I keep saying Rabbi Yehuda. I apologize. Rabbi Yehuda says, I hold of muksa. And so if it didn't have a mum before Yom Tif, you can't eat it on Yom Tif from a mum that developed. So that what you need is you need the chacham to come and say, what happened to it yesterday was a real mum.
It's kind of like nolad or something.
It's kind of like nolad, correct. It's muksa. I mean, yeah, that's.
I mean, what the possibility of it being consumed did not arise until Yom Tov.
Correct. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Yeah. If the mum was there yesterday, and you just now remember you couldn't eat it yesterday because the chacham had not seen it yet, but it existed. So therefore, you're allowed to eat it today. But if it's nolad bo today, as you put nolad, then it's considered to be muksa. And that's why you can't do it. This is more about muksa. You're right. But then if that's the case, then it's totally muksa. What's the chiddush? No, the case is in between. The nafal be mum over me erev Yom Tov. What happened was, it definitely had a mum before Yom Tov, but it was a mum over, meaning it was a wound, like it broke its leg. Let's say. I mean, I'm not an animal doctor, so I can't tell you that for sure. But it did something that it will heal from.
Yeah.
You didn't know that, right? So you have to ask the expert. So you ask the expert, and the expert comes the next day and says, "Oh, that would have gotten better, but it happened to fall into the pit now, and it broke its hind leg, and it's going to die, right? Or it's not going to heal." So you might have thought that since it had a mum over, that at least your das was on it, you thought I'm going to have it. Now it has a permanent mum. That you were planning on eating this if you could, right? Before Yom Tov, you thought, look, I want to have this cow. I got to get the expert to come and tell me. By the time the expert came, it really had a mum because it fell into the pit, but it's not the same mum. And so Kamash Malan, that it was considered muksa. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov.
Maybe the thought is that you pushed it into the pit so you could eat it or something.
So that's a whole different question, but yeah, I don't think we're going that far.
No, but I mean, there's a concern that they're playing games here.
There is a concern. It's true.
It just happened to fall into the pit on Yom Tov.
Very convenient, right before lunch.
Right.
Continues the Gemara at the Beitzah. Says the Beitzah, let's clarify this whole thing, and we're going to bring new opinions here, new Tanaim. Bechor tam shnafal bar. You have a bechor that is a tam, meaning it's complete. It has no mum. So again, the status of bechor tam is that it's essentially kodshim. The Kohen cannot do anything with it. You can't work with it, of course. You got to just wait for it to get mum. You got to keep it protected. So says the Beitzah, bechor tam shnafal bar. It falls into a pit on Yom Tif. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, not Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Omer Yerid Mumchev Yireh. An expert can go into the bar and see if it's a mum. In yeshbo mum, if it in fact has a mum ya'alev yishchot, you can take it out and shecht it. In lav lo yishchot, you cannot take it out. Okay. Now, this, just to be clear, is not like our Mishnah, because in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda was interpreted. Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, was interpreted as only talking about a case where it had a mum before Yom Tov. So it was not a bechor tam. It was a bechor with a mum over, a mum that was maybe temporary. And then the question was, if it got a new mum on Yom Tov, what happened? Here, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi seems to be posting that there's no muksa, and so it could be a bechor tam before Yom Tif, but then it got a mum on Yom Tif, and the question is, can you take it out of the pit only if a mumcha went down and said this is definitely going to be edible? Amalo Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, Rabbi Shimon says to him, Hari Amrim Einro Amuim B'Yom Tov. I hold you can't, or they said, you're not allowed to look at a mum and establish it as being a problem on Yom Tov. Ketzad, so what do? If Nolad Bo Mumi Erev Yom Tov, if the animal got a mum before Yom Tov started, Ein Mevakin on Tov Yom Tov. I disagree with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And I say you cannot look at it, you can't do a bikor, you can't do a check on Yom Tov itself, because it was there before Yom Tov. You should have, as Hanan said, you should have checked it before Yom Tov. But Nolad Bo Mum Bi Yom Tov, turn the page, but if the mum happened on Yom Tov, so then Rabbi Shimon Omer Ein Zeh Min HaMuchan. This is not prepared, meaning you can't look at it on Yom Tov because you're not allowed to look at mum on Yom Tov. But Shavim, but everybody agrees, this is a fascinating case, Shavim, that they will all agree, meaning even Rabbi Yehuda, Shem Nolad Hu Umumo Imo Shezem Min HaMuchan. That if an animal is born on Yom Tov and it is wounded when it's born, right? So you have a mother gives birth on Yom Tov itself to a Bechar, and the Bechar comes out with some very serious defect, right? Its arm is broken, it's missing a limb, whatever the mum is, right? That in that case, it's considered to be Muchan. Why is it considered to be Muchan, right? So this is really problematic according to Rashi, because Rashi made it sound earlier that the reason you can't look at a mum on Yom Tov is because you're doing a din, right? So here Rashi adds, or even earlier, Rashi added another detail, which is the reason you can't do a din is that it's not just that you're judging, because obviously, I mean, if you have a question about, is your lulav kosher, you can walk over to the rabbi or anyone and say, is my lulav kosher? Right. The issue is that by doing a din, you're basically officially certifying that something is kosher, right? And that's considered to be creating something, what we call tikkun mana. You're essentially creating a new entity, because by the court stamping it and saying, this is a mum, you're basically making it into an edible bechor. And so the action of doing that is what's called tikkun mana. Says Rashi here, and says the Gemara, that if your animal was born and it had a mum when it was born, then it was never fixed because it was always permitted. Why was it always permitted? Because if you recall, and this we learned in Chulin, and we've discussed many times since, an animal in the stomach of its mother, or as my kids put it, in the stomach, right, in the uterus of its mother, is permitted, right? So the Bechor, if you had shechted the mother on Yom Tov morning when it had not given birth yet, you can eat the fetus that's inside that mother, right? Even if it's alive. Even this baby was about to be born, so it's not a fetus anymore, right? It's called a ben pakua in that case. You can eat that animal. You don't even need to shecht it, right? Remember. So that's a totally edible animal. And then the second it was born, it becomes its own thing. But since it had a mum, the second it was born, there was never a time where it was not permitted. And therefore, by the court coming, or the dayan coming, the mumcha coming and saying you're allowed to eat this, he or she has not been mitakein anything, right? Now we're gonna specify in a little bit that they have to be present at the birth, right? Because if the mumcha is not present at the birth, then it's not permitted until you get the mumcha. So you basically have to the birth has to happen with the mumcha there, watching it, saying, "Oh boy, that animal, no concerns there. It's definitely got a mum." So in that case, when Yom Tov started, it was permitted because it was still in the mother's uterus. When the animal was born, it was mutar right away because it was born with the mum, and therefore it was never prohibited. And everybody agrees that would be permitted. Okay, good case. I'm not sure how practical it is. I'm not sure how often this happens.
Right.
But anyways, that doesn't stop us. Okay, third line. Darish Rabba Barafuna. Rabba Barafuna, obviously in Amora, many generations later, said, Nolad hu umumo imo, if an animal is born, a bechor, is born with a mum on Yom Tov, nivakrino to b'Yom Tov l'chadchila. You're allowed to look at the mum with an expert, even l'chadchila, because since it was born with it, it's not a problem. Amali Rav Nachman, Abba, Rav Nachman said, my father, it's not going to my father or our father, meaning our teacher, Tani, our teacher taught, Im avaru bikro mevukar. If you go against the rule and you check it, it's okay. But you're saying you can do it l'chatchila. Vat amr nevakar and so l'chatchila. Amar Abaye. So clearly there's an argument about whether you're allowed to do it or if you do it, it's okay. Amar Abaye says Abaye, well, kavate de Rabba Barafuna Mistava. It makes more sense to me to go like Rabbi Bar Hafuna, that you're allowed to do it lichatchila. Because mitiktani tlata bavi. Remember, our Beitzah that we just quoted had 3 separate cases, and we're going to review them all for you. So keep this straight. It's very complicated. 3 separate cases. What are the 3 cases? Case 1 is nolad bo mum mi erev yom tov. An animal gets a mum on erev yom tov. You don't know if that's a permanent mum or a temporary mum. You don't know if you're allowed to eat it, right? You did not get the chacham to look at it, the mumcha to look at it. Said the Beitzah, ein mivakrin oto b'yom tov, period. You cannot check out this mum on Yom Tov. You should have done it before Yom Tov, or it's too much work on Yom Tov. It's what's called tikkun mana, because the animal is not edible. You might make it edible. You should not do that on Yom Tov. But the implication of that Beitzah, of those words, now we're paraphrasing, now we're analyzing, is l'tchatchila hu delo. You shouldn't do it. Hadi have a chopper dummy. But if you went against the rule and you did it, then that would be okay. If you went against the rule and you did it, if you did it b'diavad, it would be okay, right? So that's the first case in the Beitzah. The second case, now we're quoting again, is nolad bo mum b'yom tov. It did not have a mum when Yom Tov started, but on Yom Tov this animal got a mum. It developed this mum during the holiday, this bechor. So there, Rabbi Shimon said, ein zemin amuchan. This is not something that was prepared. And again, Rabbi Shimon doesn't care about muksa so much, but he cares about you're not allowed to be ro in mumin on Yom Tov. So Rabbi Shimon said that you can't do this. You cannot eat this animal, even, that implies even diavad, namilo. Even if you went against the rule and you showed the mum to a chacham, and the chacham said this is permanent, or you tricked them and you said, oh, this happened yesterday, does it count? You know, that it's a sort even diavad, right? So that's the second case. What's the third case?
So that includes the case of the animal falling into the pit?
If it didn't have a mum before Yom Tov.
Right.
Right. Yeah, the animal falling in the pit, according to this, and that's how we go, is only if it had a mum before Yom Tov. If it fell and you got another mum, right? So the question is, can the chacham go into the pit and can you take it out of the pit?
No.
Right? Another thing.
Yeah.
The third case now, Hadar Tani, now you said a third case. The third case is Shavim, they all agree, Shem Nolad Umumo Imo, right? If it was born and it had a mum with on Yom Tov, Shazem Min Hamuchan, that's okay. And the implication then is the first case was prohibited lichatchila but mutar b'diavad. The second case was asur even b'diavad. The third case, the implication is da'afila lichatchila, that it's mutar nami, that you can even do it lichatchila, meaning it's 3 different statuses, 3 different categories. The third category is even lichatchila, even you're allowed to show this mum to a chacham, even the mumcha, even lichatchila on Yom Tov. So that implies exactly what Rabbi Bar Hafuna said, that it's not even that b'diavad you can do it. You can do it even lichatchila as well. Well, that's very good if you have that Beitzah. But the problem is that when Rav Oshaya came, and Rav Oshaya was a very famous aggregator of knowledge. And Rav Oshaya used to come and bring, the newest things I learned, volume 16, and would quote over all the Breitos, right? So when Rav Oshaya came, Kiata Rav Oshaya from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he quoted the following Breitzah. And his Breitzah did not have 3 cases. His Breitzah said, Bein shenolad bo mum erev Yom Tov, Bein shenolad bo mum b'Yom Tov. He combined the first 2 cases. Whether the mum was born, the wound came erev Yom Tov, or it came on Yom Tov, then Chachamim omrim ein zeh min hamuchan. The Chachamim say it's not okay. So meaning there aren't 3 cases. There's only 2 cases. So there are only 2 cases. Says well, so that goes against Rabbi Bar Hafuna, who said, well, it's not against him, but it doesn't prove it. Rabbi Bar Hafuna proved his point from the fact that there were 3 cases in the Breitzah, but when Rav Oshaya came, there were only 2 cases in the Breitzah. Well, that's very nice for Rav Oshaya, but what about the first Breitzah that we quoted? Elakashahach, well, what about the first Breitzah, which had 3 cases? Well, that Breitzah, that was a Hahi Adar Bar Uchmahu. That was quoted in the name of Adar Bar Uchma. Adar Bar Uchma was not the most accurate fact checker. The Meshabesh Fitani, he would make mistakes and teach them. I mean, he was not known for being very textually accurate. So Rav Oshaya had a great reputation. Adar Bar Uchma, he had a good memory. He taught over a lot of things, but he wasn't exactly perfect. So when you hear something from Adar Bar Uchma, take it with a grain of salt. And if you hear something else from Rav Oshaya, that's obviously going to be a more authoritative source. Okay.
Well, but there still is this third case. It could happen,
No,
right?
there's a third case. The question is there three separate categories or is it two categories? Right? According to Rav Oshaya now,
The third case would fall into which
no,
category?
its own category. But the thing is that if the first two cases are one category, then
Yeah,
all it's saying is that you even lechatchila cannot check it on Yom Tov,
right,
even b'diavad. So
right.
now when the third case comes, which is really a second case now, that the animal was born on Yom Tov
Yeah,
with a mum,
yeah,
we saying everyone agrees that it's permitted. But what we don't have an answer to is, does everyone agree that it's permitted lechatchila, or does everyone agree that it's permitted b'diavad, right? Meaning it's definitely permitted after the fact.
mhm,
And you cannot verify from the Beitzah whether the Beitzah is saying you're allowed to do it even lechatchila or not.
right.
You just can't assess that. So we don't know one way or the other. But so it's an argument. It's a machloket. Continue the Gemara. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak matnita nami teka. In fact, if you read our Mishnah, it seems to imply also that it's only b'diavad. The Ketani, because remember, our Mishnah said, Rabbi Shimon Omer kol she'ein mumo nikar me'erev Yom Tov ein ze min hamuchan. Any animal whose mum was not recognizable before Yom Tov started is not permitted because it's not ready. It's not prepared for Yom Tov. And what did he mean, Rabbi Shimon? My ein mumo nikar. What do you mean its wound was not recognizable? Ilema ein mumo nikar klal, meaning it had no wound. It was a perfectly healthy animal. So pshita, that's obvious. Shricha l'meimar. You need to tell me that an animal that had no mum before Yom Tov, that got a mum on Yom Tov is prohibited. Everyone knows that. It wasn't permitted to eat when Yom Tov started. Ella must be it had a mum on before Yom Tov, but the lo it chazi l'chacham erev Yom Tov imum kavua imum over. Right? You didn't show it to a chacham before Yom Tov to know whether the mum that you had was a temporary mum or a permanent mum. So kentani miyot ein zem min hamuchan. And clearly here he's saying ein zem min hamuchan shma mina. You see from here that even this case, even b'di'avad, right, is not min hamuchan. So that what the Mishnah is telling you is that if you didn't show it before Yom Tov, even b'di'avad, it's not min hamuchan. So then when the Beitzah comes and adds a case and says, oh, but if it was born with the mum, then it's okay. All that seems to be doing is permitting it one level up. Meaning, if it didn't have it before Yom Tov, it's totally prohibited.
Right.
If it was born with it on Yom Tov, then it's mutar b'di'avad. But all you can learn from there, and that seems to imply, is that you basically can get one level up. It's only mutar b'di'avad, but not mutar lichatchila. So that's how it seems.
What difference would it make if it has a tam or a mum over? In either case, you can't eat it.
It's a very good question. But presumably, this is a very, very good question. So this is something I glossed over because it's complicated. But the real question is the big question is, what's your intention, right? What's your,
Right.
did you have it in mind? So if
Yeah.
you have, right, this is a very good question. Let's say you have a bechor with a mum, right? You have no way of knowing if it's, well,
Right.
let me rephrase that, because you might know very well, right? You're a farmer. You know very well this is a real mum.
Yeah.
The thing is that you're not allowed to say that.
Right. Right.
So that presumably you can rely on the fact, look, I know for sure this is a mum. I just have to find the chacham to come and tell me.
Right.
So sure, I'll find someone. So that might not be muksa because you're assuming it's going to be okay.
Right. Okay.
Right. So that's why it matters. But again, you're right. It
That's
could
a
very
good
well be that if you didn't think the mum was going to be a real mum, that it wouldn't help.
Right. Good.
Okay, continues the Gemara, a new thing that's related, but we're going to, the rest of today's daf, a separate question, not relating to a mum, but it's a very interesting question. Ba'amine Hillel mi Rav. Hillel, obviously not Hillel Zaken, because Rava lived around 300 years or 200 years after Hillel Zaken. But Hillel, there was an Amora named Hillel. Do they have they call him Rav Hillel here, because usually that's how the Amoraim, or the Amora named Hillel was designated. So Ba'amine Rav Hillel mi Rava. Yesh muksa lechatzi Shabbat or ein muksa lechatzi Shabbat. Can something be muktzah for only part of Shabbat, or is there no such concept of muktzah for part of Shabbat? What does that mean? One second. What are you talking about? If remember, we always have said that it's when the Shabbat starts that counts, right? If the thing was permitted, meaning it was something you could have when Ben Hashemashot started, then achsi, then it's mutar all of Shabbat. Ida lo achsi, if it's not permitted when Ben Hashmashot came, when Shabbat started, lo achsi. So what's your question? What half of Shabbat are you talking about? We're lo tzricha. No, we're talking about a case which is not uncommon. De achsi. When Shabbat started or Yom Tov started, the food or the animal, the thing was permitted. It was totally usable. But hadar itchi, but then something happened to make it not usable, and then hadar ichsi, and then it became usable again. So by the time you wake up in the morning, it's again usable. But it went through a period overnight when it wasn't usable. So what's the case? Is that the fact that it became muksas, quote unquote, for a period of time, does that change its status for the rest of Shabbos? Amar lei, he said to him, yesh muktzah. That is considered muktzah. Meaning, even though when Shabbos started, this was something that you could eat, or that was permitted, or that was ready for you, but then over Shabbos, it got problematic. The fact that later on it became okay is not okay. The case Rashi gives, since you probably want a case here, is that you had fruit. You had food that was laying out on your porch, right? It was dried food, it was edible. Overnight it rained. When it rained, this was all mushy and not edible. And so during the rain, basically it became pushed off. It became inedible. But then it dried out again, right? The sun came out. It's an itsy bitsy spider song, right? Or whatever. And the sun came out and it dried it up again. And so your things were edible. So the question is the fact that during the night they were inedible because no one would eat mushy, bread, let's say, right? That was rained on, then it dried out and it was edible again. Is it permitted on Shabbat? So Amar Lei, so he answered him, Yesh Muktzah. That's a problem. Eitvei, so they asked a question from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say, or our Beitzah? Shavim shem nolad umuo imo shezem amuchan. This animal that was born on Yom Tov with a mum is considered to be okay. Why is that okay? Vamai, nema hai bechor meikar havi chazi. Why don't you say that this bechor, when Yom Tov started, havi chazi agavime, right? Of course, you could have eaten it because it was still in the mother's uterus. And so if you shechted the mother, you can eat the baby. So when Yom Tov started, the animal was edible, as long as you shechted the mother. It yalid, once it's born, it now needs shchita. So it's not edible. Achzi lechacham, you show it to the chacham, ishtri. Now it's permitted. So why isn't this a classic case where it was permitted when Yom Tov started? It became asur because it was born, and then it became permitted once the chacham said it had a mum, and we said you're allowed to have it. Amar Abaye, v'temer Safra, you're right. Go yatvi daini hatam, as I told you earlier. It has to be a case where it was permitted as it was born, because the Dayanim were sitting there watching the birth, and they were like, oh boy, this animal definitely has a mum. And so there was never a moment where the animal was prohibited. Ika da Amri, now some say the opposite. Amri lei ein muktzah lechatzi Shabbat. He said there's no muktzah lechatzi Shabbat, meaning, and this is how we pass it, that once something was permitted when Shabbat started, the fact that it became prohibited during Shabbat, remember, when it's prohibited, you can't eat it. But when it later becomes permitted, you can. So, ein muktzah lechatzi Shabbat. Lema misayele. So now let's prove that from this case. It says, Shavim shem noladu mo imoshes emin amuchan. Everyone agrees that if a Bechar is born on Yom Tov, and it has a mum when it's born, that it's permitted. What do you mean? The Bechar is this exact case. When Yom Tov started, it was permitted because of its mother. Yalidle, once it's born, it's pushed off because it's now its own animal, and it's a Bechar, so it can't be shechted right away. But achze the chacham, if you then show it to the scholar and you get permitted, ishtrile, then it becomes permitted. So this seems to imply that that it's a proof to this halacha. It says, and that's what Rabbiya said. Rabbiya, v'temer Safra. No, it could very well be that case is only permitted because the Dayanim were sitting there, and so there was never a moment where this animal could not be eaten. When it was in its mother's uterus, it was edible because it was with the mother. Once it's born, it's immediately mutter because it has a bechor, it has a mum. Anyways, that's the halacha. Tashma, let's try to prove this from another Beitzah. Says the Beitzah in Shabbos, Haya ochel anavim. Let's say a person is eating grapes on Shabbos. It doesn't have to be on Shabbos, but let's just say, okay? he's eating anavim, okay, and it's just a lot of grapes. They bought too many grapes, so he finishes eating what he wants to eat, and he doesn't know what to do with the leftovers. So in an age without refrigeration, right? What you would do with the leftovers is you would put them up on your roof so they could dry out and become raisins, right? So a person's eating his anavim, v'hotir, he's got extra ones left. Halan legag lasot mehem tzimukim. You put them up on the roof to dry them out, to make them into raisins. Or you're eating te'imim. Same thing is true about te'imim or dates, right? V'hotir, and you have too many. V'halan legag lasot mehem grogrot. You make dried dates, which are grogrot. Or says the Beitzah, lo yochal mehen ad sheyazmin mi ba'od yom. You should not eat them on Shabbos, even when they became raisins, unless you had said before Shabbos, I want to eat these things. Meaning, you don't know when they're going to get dried out and become edible, right? Because remember, you don't want to have mushy raisins, right? You got to have really dried out raisins. So you don't know, maybe it'll take a day, maybe it'll take 5 days. I guess it depends on how dry and hot it is, right? Or a month, I don't know. But you can't eat them unless you thought before Shabbos, I'm going to eat them. Meaning the fact that you put these on the roof doesn't automatically make them raisins. You have to know that they're ready. So that's what the Beitzah says. It's true about all the dried fruits that people have. Dried apricots, I think is what a farsakim are, right? I don't know, chavushim are quinces maybe or something. Not quinces, I don't know, some. Okay, quinces, I don't know what those are, but dried peaches, all mine perot. You can't eat them unless you say before Shabbos, I want to eat them.
So this is only if you specifically put them to dry out beforehand. Then what if they are in a place where they're exposed to the sun and they're going to dry on their own without you putting them in a specific place? Do you still have to designate them before Shabbat?
So the answer is yes, but the issue here is that the question is, are they ready or not? Right? You don't know. You put your grapes on the roof. You don't have a sense without going up on the roof and checking as whether they became raisins, right? So we're assuming this is our case, right? That when a fruit is fresh, it's edible. When it gets dried out, it's not edible. It's moldy and it's rotten, and you're not going to eat a peach that sat on your roof for 3 weeks. But then when it gets sufficiently dried out to be a dried peach, then you're going to eat it, right? So there's some middle time when it's not edible. I don't actually know that much about making dried fruit.
It takes more than a day, that's for sure.
So that's not the question. This is not the time. The question is there an interim period when it's not edible? That's what we're saying.
The question is, can you do it like Chila? Can you start the process on Shabbat?
No, nothing to do with that. You could start the process 5 weeks ago.
No.
The point is this.
So that's not the issue.
The issue is you don't know before Shabbat started, presumably, whether your grapes are edible or not.
Okay.
So you put them up specifically with the purpose of making them edible with raisins.
Right.
The question is, without going up to your roof and saying, "Oh, these look good," are you allowed to then eat them on Shabbat?
So you need to check them before Shabbat. Oh, it looks like they're going to be ready. So then they're from the Muchan.
I want to eat them.
Yeah.
So that's what the Beitzah seems to say, and it's true by all things. Now says Gemara Hechidam, but what's the case? Eat the chazul, right? If the raisins were ready before Shabbos started, and you didn't know about it, who cares? You don't need to know about it, right? Meaning, if you go up the next day and you're like, "Oh, these have been ready for a week. I'm sorry I didn't come up sooner." So then they were ready when Shabbos started.
Right.
So what do you need hazmana? Lamali hazmana. Well, I don't need to announce that everything that I want in my kitchen I want to eat on Shabbos.
Right.
If it's edible, it's edible. Eat the lo chazi. If they weren't ready when Shabbos started and they only became ready on Shabbos, then ki azman hu ma'avi. I can't say, "Oh, I want to eat this inedible thing." It's not edible, right? Remember, it always goes after when Shabbos starts.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the hazmana? Says, well, maybe right? You didn't know because you haven't gone up to your roof to check. Ichazi lo chazi. Well, says, well, if you don't know, Amar Rav Kahana said, Muksa sheyavesh, if you have something that was muksa, meaning it was not edible, it was set aside, it was inedible because it was on the roof, right? And it dried out before Shabbos started, the ein ha'ba'alim mekirim bo, but the owners don't know that, it's mutar. It doesn't matter if the owners know it. You don't have to have knowledge. As long as you can demonstrate that it was clearly edible when Shabbos started, you didn't have to know that when Shabbos started. Ella la. Now again, this is because you put it on the roof, right? It's not. It didn't just happen to fall there. You specifically put this on the roof in order to become dried out. You just don't have to know the timing of that. Ella must be that lav dechazu. It must be that when Shabbos started, it was edible because it was, let's say, dried out, right? And then idchu, but then it got pushed off on Shabbos because it rained, or because I guess and so it's no longer edible. And then hadar ichsu, and then it became chazi, it became ra'oi again. So we're saying in that case, you have to say, I want to designate that I'm going to eat this. Even though, again, you go up there before Shabbos, you say, my raisins look great. I want to eat them tomorrow. I know it's going to rain tonight, but I know that it's going to get really hot after the rain. And by tomorrow afternoon, no one will know that it even rained. Then it's okay. It says in muktzah, if there's no muktzah for part of Shabbos, why do you have to say that? Lama lo hazmana. It says, well, elamai yesh muktzah. So what are you telling me? There is muktzah? So by announcing that I'm going to eat it, doesn't get rid of muktzah, right? You can't get up on Shabbos and before Shabbos and say, I'm going to carry a candle this Shabbos. Right? Obviously, you can't just get rid of muktzah by saying you want to do it, right? So elamai yesh muktzah ki azman hu mai havi. So what does it help to say hazmana, right? Lo tzricha says more. It must be the achsu v'lo achsu. It must be that it's talking about a situation where they're partially edible, right? Some people eat it, some people don't eat it. Some people eat this on Shabbos any day, and some people won't eat it, right? Meaning, Azmin, if you say, I'm going to eat this tomorrow, Gali Daite, that you're going to eat it, that you're the kind of person. Lo Azmin, lo Gali Daite. If you don't, then you have not revealed your thought on this. And so this does not prove one way or the other. And again, it seems likely, we'll discuss this a little more tomorrow, but it seems likely that we end up paskening ein muktzah lechatzi Shabbat, right? That if something is prepared when Shabbat started, and then something happens to it that makes it inedible, and then over Shabbat, it then becomes edible again, you're allowed to eat it. But the reason that we want you to designate these raisins and other things is that it's a situation where not everyone would eat it. And so we want you to be in a situation where you clarify, I'm the kind of person who will eat this in order for it to be permitted on Shabbat.
But this is like only the owner.
This is only the owner.
So if I live in a building where there's a rooftop and you put your whatever fruits to dry on the rooftop, and I don't know that it's you, and I'm there and I look at it, am I allowed to eat it?
So again, you can't steal it, of course, right? But presumably, the whole purpose of this hazmana is to say, this is the kind of thing I would eat. I find this edible, right? And then obviously, then if the owner gives you permission to eat it, you're allowed to eat it on Shabbos.
Okay.
We're going to see tomorrow a little bit. I'm going to stop here because I have to run, unfortunately. But the next case, which actually is a little bit more relevant, is a question of cooking, right? Because it's very often the case that when you cook something, it's edible in some format, and then it gets into this is the case, at least the Gemara says, and then it becomes inedible in some intermediate format, and then becomes more edible at the end, right? So again, a lot of that will depend on what is a person willing to eat. But you'll do that case tomorrow, bottom line of Rabbi Zera, and tomorrow's Hoshana Rabbah.
So no law has to do with the actual coming into existence of something rather than like, oh, it came into my awareness. Like I didn't know this was in my refrigerator. Oh, I just found it in my refrigerator. I can still, right? It was there. I just didn't know about it.
Right. I'll just take that a step further. You don't need to designate. You don't need to stand before Shabbos and say, I'm going to eat my cholent this Shabbos. You know what I mean? Like
no, I know.
The cholent, if it exists, it's edible when Shabbos starts, which is a different question, right? If it's edible when Shabbos starts, then it's okay.
Right. Even if I didn't know, I had stuffed it in the back of the closet or something, whatever, and I was pulling things out. And, oh, I have this. Oh.
Right. So, the reality is that there is a level of something that's so unimagined that it might be prohibited. But the assumption, of course, is that people know that they have a lot of food that they're not aware of in their house. They're going to eat it. Okay. We're going to send an email, but we're planning to do an hour before Mincha on Shmini Atzeret.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.